Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward. Perhaps you know me from Warm Pages as well. Before we begin, I'd love to hear about a hobby or small joy that brightened your week. Maybe knitting, gardening, reading, or listening to cosy mysteries like this one. Share your little joys with us. And don't forget to subscribe. Now get comfortable. Our story is about to begin. Chapter 1. The Bitter Frost and the Corporate Killjoy. The village of Lochdoub lay wrapped in the sort of Highland winter that made even the hardiest crofter long for his fireside. A thick, damp fog had rolled in from the black waters of the loch, turning the scattered cottages into ghostly shapes and making the whole of Sutherland look like something out of a Gothic novel. East Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the window of his kitchen, watching the mist swirl past with the satisfaction of a man who had absolutely no intention of going out in it. Tall and thin, with hazel eyes that held a deceptive sleepiness, he was perfectly content with his lot in life. The police station doubled as his home, a comfortable arrangement that suited him down to the ground. Behind him, his dog Lugs raised his head from the rag rug, his odd fringed ears giving him a permanently startled expression. Beside the dog, Sonsy, the wild cat Hamish had somehow domesticated, stretched luxuriously, her amber eyes blinking at the peat fire crackling in the stove. It was the sort of day, Hamish reflected, that called for absolutely nothing more strenuous than tending to his small flock of sheep and perhaps making a pot of strong tea. The annual Hogmanay gathering was still days away, and if he played his cards right, he could avoid any serious police work until well into the new year. The village was preparing for the traditional New Year celebrations with its usual Highland mix of enthusiasm and stubbornness. Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, had already declared war on anyone who dared suggest serving anything less than her famous clooty dumpling. The Curry sisters were engaged in their annual debate about whether the first footing should begin at 1 minute past midnight or a respectable 5 minutes later. And Archie MacLean was spending even more time than usual at the pub, claiming he needed to discuss the bonfire arrangements while actually hiding from his formidable wife. Hamish was just reaching for the teapot when he heard the sound of an expensive car engine struggling up the icy track that served as Lochdoub's main street. He frowned. The village rarely saw visitors in winter, and certainly not the sort who drove what sounded like a large German saloon. The car came to a stop outside the Napoli restaurant, and Hamish watched with growing unease as a man emerged. Even from a distance, everything about him screamed London money and London arrogance. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Hamish earned in 3 months, wholly inadequate for Highland weather, and he moved with the aggressive confidence of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself around him. Hamish sighed. Peace, he had learned over the years, was a fragile thing in the Highlands. By evening, the entire village was buzzing with outrage. Hamish heard about it first from the Curry sisters, who appeared at his door in a state of high agitation. "That man," said Nessie Curry, her thin face pinched with fury. "That man," echoed her sister Jessie, who had the unnerving habit of repeating everything Nessie said. "Says he's going to ban the bonfire," Nessie continued. "Ban the bonfire," confirmed Jessie. "On what grounds?" Hamish asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. "Health and safety," both sisters said in unison, making it sound like a curse. The man, it transpired, was called Alistair Vane, and he had been hired by someone in the county council to conduct a risk assessment of the village hall and the Hogmanay celebrations. He had wasted no time in making his presence felt and his opinions known. Hamish found him that evening in the pub, holding court with the sort of loud, braying confidence that made the locals exchange dark glances over their whisky glasses. Vane was a large man, running to fat with small eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently curved in a sneer. Primitive nonsense, he was saying to no one in particular. First footing, indeed, in this day and age. And as for lighting a massive fire in the village square, it's a wonder no one's been killed already. "We've been doing it for 200 years, said Archie MacLean quietly. "Then you've been lucky for 200 years, Vane shot back. But luck runs out. I'm here to make sure your little village doesn't end up as a headline in the Daily Mail. corporate responsibility. You understand, can't have lawsuits. There's never been any trouble, the barman ventured. Vane laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. That's what they all say, right before someone breaks their neck or burns the village down. No, I'm afraid I'll be recommending a complete ban on outdoor fires and any activity that could be considered remotely hazardous, including, I might add, allowing intoxicated individuals to wander from house to house in the middle of the night carrying coal and whiskey. The temperature in the pub, already cold from the winter night, seemed to drop several more degrees. Hamish, nursing a small whiskey in the corner, recognised the danger signs. Highland folk were peaceable enough, but push them too far about their traditions and there would be trouble. It was Mrs. Morag Menzies who stepped in as peacemaker. She was a small, soft-spoken woman who served as the village archivist and volunteer at the Heritage Centre. Everything about her was gentle, from her carefully styled grey hair to her quiet voice. "I'm sure Mr. Vane is only trying to help," she said, her voice barely audible above the muttering. "Perhaps if we showed him how carefully we manage everything, he might see there's no real danger." She moved through the hostile crowd, bringing tea to the angry crofters, speaking in soothing tones and generally acting as oil on troubled waters. When she caught Hamish's eye, she smiled apologetically, as if the stranger's rudeness was somehow her fault. Later, after Vane had retired to his rented cottage, and the pub had emptied of all but the most dedicated drinkers, Morag appeared at the police station with a basket. "I thought you might like some fresh scones," she said, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Terrible weather we're having, and you're looking after us all. It's the least I can do." Hamish accepted the basket with thanks, watching as she disappeared back into the fog. She was, he reflected, one of the kindest souls in Lochdew, always thinking of others, always ready with a helping hand. He took the scones inside and shared one with Lugs and Sonsie. The dog wolfed his portion down immediately, while the cat ate with more delicacy, purring contentedly. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the darkness the black waters of the loch lapped against the shore. Hamish banked the fire and settled into his armchair, hoping that Alistair Vane would finish his assessment quickly and leave before he caused any real trouble. It was, he thought sleepily, a vain hope. Men like Vane always caused trouble. It was what they did. But even Hamish, with all his experience of the darker side of Highland life, could not have predicted just how much trouble was coming, or how blood would stain the frost before the new year arrived. Chapter 2. A Grim Discovery in the Hall. Hamish woke the next morning to the insistent ringing of his telephone, a sound he had learned to dread over his years as Lochdoob's constable. Nothing good ever came from early morning phone calls. He stumbled out of bed, Lugs trotting hopefully behind him in case the disturbance meant an early breakfast, and lifted the receiver. "Hamish?" It was Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, and her voice was shaking. "You'd better come to the village hall right away." "What's happened?" "It's that man, that awful London man. He's dead." Hamish was suddenly wide awake. "Are you certain?" "Oh, I'm certain all right. His head's been staved in with something heavy. There's blood everywhere." Her voice rose. "I only went in to check the heating before the decorating committee arrived." "Oh, Hamish." "It's dreadful." "Don't touch anything," Hamish said sharply, "and keep everyone out until I get there. I'll be along directly." He dressed quickly, his mind already working through the implications. A murder in Lochdubh was bad enough, but the victim being an outsider would bring down all sorts of official attention he could well do without. He grabbed his official jacket, made sure his notebook was in the pocket, and headed out into the morning. The fog had lifted slightly, but the village was still wrapped in a damp, bone-chilling cold that made his breath steam. He could see a small crowd already gathering outside the village hall, villagers clustering together and speaking in low, shocked voices. Mrs. Wellington met him at the door, her normally formidable presence diminished by shock. "He's in the gear room at the back. I didn't go any further in once I saw him." Hamish made his way through the main hall, past the stage where the Village Amateur Dramatic Society performed their annual pantomime, and towards the small room at the rear where equipment was stored. The door stood open, and even from several feet away he could smell the coppery tang of blood. Alistair Vane lay sprawled on the floor, his expensive suit now stained and rumpled. His head had been crushed by something heavy, and that something lay beside him. An antique cast-iron peat cutter, part of the heritage display that Morag Menzies had so lovingly assembled to show visitors the old Highland ways. Hamish crouched down, careful not to disturb anything, and studied the scene. The blow had been precise and powerful. This was no accident, no panicked scuffle. Someone had struck Vane down with deliberate force. What caught his attention, however, was something else entirely. The gear room had only one entrance, the door through which he had just come. The small window was locked from the inside, its catch firmly in place. More puzzling still, there were no obvious signs of disturbance, no indication that Vane had been dragged here. He must have come of his own accord late last night by the look of things. But how had the killer escaped from a locked room? Hamish stood up and surveyed the space carefully. The floor was concrete, the walls solid stone. There was no clever mechanism, no hidden panel. Just a straightforward storage room that appeared to offer no way out except through the door he had entered. He was still pondering this when he heard the sound of cars arriving outside, followed by the unmistakable bellow of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Hamish sighed. Of all the detectives at Strathbane headquarters, Blair was the worst possible choice for this investigation. The man was lazy, spiteful, and prone to bullying tactics that inevitably made everything worse. Worse still, he harboured a deep and abiding hatred for Hamish, born of professional jealousy and too many past cases where the village constable had quietly shown him up. Blair came storming into the hall like an angry bull, his fat face already red with exertion and whisky fumes preceding him. Behind him came his long-suffering subordinates, Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, who had the look of a man nursing a serious hangover, and Detective Sergeant Andy McNabb taking notes with methodical precision. "Right then, Macbeth," Blair barked. "What have we got?" Hamish gave him a concise summary, pointing out the locked window and the absence of any obvious exit route. Blair barely listened, his small eyes already gleaming with the prospect of a headline-making arrest. "Locked room nonsense," he said dismissively. "Someone's been reading too many detective novels. The killer probably just locked it behind them to muddy the waters. We'll have this wrapped up before lunch." The window was locked from the inside, Hamish pointed out mildly. So? Could have been locked beforehand. Now who found the body? Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife. And who had reason to want this fellow dead? I understand he wasn't popular. That, Hamish reflected, was putting it mildly. Half the village had wanted to throttle Alistair Vane after his performance in the pub, but wanting someone dead and actually killing them were two very different things. Before he could answer, there was a gentle cough from the doorway. Morag Menzies stood there, holding a large thermos and several cups. "I thought you gentlemen might appreciate some hot coffee," she said softly. "It's terrible cold in here, and you'll be working for hours, I expect." Blair's face softened slightly. "I? Well, that's kind of you, Mrs. Menzies. Morag Menzies. I'm the village archivist." She poured coffee with steady hands, seemingly unaffected by the violence that had occurred just feet away. Such a dreadful business. That poor man, however rude he might have been. "You knew the victim?" Blair asked, suddenly alert. "Only to see him in the pub yesterday evening. He was very upset about our Hogmanay traditions." She handed Blair a cup. "I tried to calm things down, but feelings were running rather high." "I'll need a list of everyone who was there," Blair said, pulling out his own notebook with a flourish. Morag nodded. "I've already prepared one. I thought it might be helpful." She produced a neatly written sheet of paper. "Every person who was in the pub when Mr. Vane was making his announcements. I've also noted which ones he specifically threatened with legal action over various property matters." Blair took the list with evident satisfaction. "Excellent. Very public-spirited of you, Mrs. Menzies." Hamish watched this exchange with interest. Morag was being almost too helpful, anticipating the investigation's needs before they were even expressed. Then again, she had always been like that, always thinking ahead. always ready to assist. She caught his eye and smiled apologetically. "I know it seems forward of me, Constable Macbeth, but I thought I should do what I could to help. After all, the sooner this is resolved, the sooner our village can return to normal." "Quite right," Blair said, warming to her. "Unlike some folk around here who seem determined to obstruct justice." He shot Hamish a meaningful glare, then turned to his team. "Right. Anderson, get the photographer in here. McNab, start interviewing everyone on this list. And Macbeth, you stay out of the way. This is a professional investigation now." Hamish retreated to a corner, ostensibly cowed, but actually using the opportunity to observe. The forensics team arrived and began their meticulous work, photographing the body, dusting for prints, collecting samples. Morag remained nearby, quietly offering more coffee, replacing cups as they emptied, the perfect image of concerned helpfulness. It was only when she was refilling Blair's cup for the third time that Hamish noticed something odd. Her hand, which had been perfectly steady when she first arrived, now trembled ever so slightly. Just a fraction, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. He filed the observation away for later consideration. The body was eventually removed, and the forensics team packed up their equipment. Blair announced his intention to return to Strathbane to coordinate the investigation from headquarters, which meant, Hamish knew, that he intended to drink whiskey in his office while his subordinates did the actual work. As the official vehicles departed, Hamish remained behind, standing in the empty hall. The blood had been photographed and documented, but it would need to be cleaned up eventually. Someone would have to tell Mrs. Wellington that her decorating committee would need to wait. He walked back to the gear room and stood in the doorway trying to see what he had missed. The locked window, the single door, the heavy weapon lying beside the body. Someone had killed Alistair Vane in a locked room and then vanished like morning mist. The question was, how? And more importantly, who? Outside, the winter afternoon was already darkening into evening, and somewhere in the village a murderer was going about their business, perhaps thinking they had gotten away with it. Hamish had no intention of letting that stand. Chapter 3. Sifting the Highland Gossip. Hamish spent the rest of that day doing what he did best, wandering about the village, ostensibly achieving nothing while actually gathering every scrap of information the locals were willing to share. Blair might have his official investigation, his forensics teams and his formal interviews, but Hamish had something far more valuable: the trust of Lochdoub's inhabitants. His first stop was the Curry sisters, who lived in a neat cottage overlooking the harbour. They greeted him with identical expressions of scandalised delight, the way people do when something terrible has happened, but they themselves are safely uninvolved. "We saw him, Constable," Nessie said, ushering Hamish into their spotless parlour. "Saw him," echoed Jessie. "Yesterday afternoon." "Ah, before all the unpleasantness in the pub." "Before the pub," Jessie confirmed. Hamish accepted a cup of tea and a piece of seed cake, knowing from experience that the sisters' information would emerge at its own pace, like water from a reluctant tap. "Who did you see?" he prompted gently. "That Vane man. Down by the harbour he was." "By the harbour?" "Having a right set to with a younger fellow. Couldn't hear what they were saying, mind, but there was a lot of arm-waving and pointing fingers." "Pointing fingers?" Jessie nodded vigorously. "What did this younger man look like?" Hamish pulled out his notebook. The sisters exchanged glances, engaging in some form of silent twin communication that Hamish had long since given up trying to understand. 30-ish, Nessie said finally. Dark hair, expensive coat. "Not from around here?" "Not local," Jessie agreed. "Had the look of Edinburgh about him, or maybe Glasgow, somewhere with buildings anyway." Hamish made a note. A stranger arguing with Vane the day before the murder was certainly worth investigating, though how the man had managed to enter and exit a locked room remained a mystery. He finished his tea and made his excuses, promising to keep the sisters informed of developments. As he left, he could hear them already beginning their gleeful dissection of every detail, their voices carrying on the cold air. His next visit was to old Angus MacDonald, who lived in a tumble-down cottage at the edge of the village. Angus claimed to have the second sight, and half of Lochdu believed him, while the other half thought he was a fraud. Hamish fell firmly into the latter camp, but he had learned that Angus had an uncanny network of informants and heard things that never reached official ears. He found the old man sitting by his peat fire, a glass of whisky at his elbow, and a cunning gleam in his rheumy eyes. "I've been expecting ye, Hamish," Angus said in his quavering voice. "I saw it in the tea leaves this morning. Death has come to Lochdoub." "Death came yesterday, Angus, so your tea leaves are a bit behind the times." Hamish pulled up a stool. "What have you heard?" Angus cackled. "Straight to business, eh? No time for an old man's visions." "I'll listen to your visions after you tell me what you know." The old man took a sip of whisky, drawing out the moment. "There's talk," he said finally. "Talk of secrets. That Vane fellow, he was digging into things, asking questions about old land deals, old debts. Folk are worried about what he might have found." "What sort of things?" "Who owns what? Who sold what to whom and when? Property matters." Angus tapped the side of his nose. "In the Highlands, Hamish, land and family go back generations. Start pulling at those threads and you never know what might unravel." It wasn't much, but it confirmed what Hamish had suspected. Vane had been doing more than just assessing safety risks. He had been poking into the village's business, and that was never wise. He left Angus to his whisky and his visions and made his way back towards the police station. The winter afternoon was drawing in, and lights were beginning to appear in cottage windows. Somewhere a dog barked, and the smell of peat smoke hung heavy in the air. He was almost home when Jimmy Anderson's car pulled up beside him. The detective inspector rolled down the window looking thoroughly miserable. "Hamish, you bastard! Blair's got me running interviews until midnight. Any chance of a wee dram to ward off the cold?" Hamish smiled. Jimmy was Blair's second in command, but unlike his superior, he was a decent sort who appreciated the value of cooperation. More importantly, he could be persuaded to share information after a glass or two of good whisky. "Come way in," Hamish said. "I've a bottle of the Macallan that's been waiting for just such an occasion." Inside the police station, with lugs settled at their feet, and Sonsi watching from her perch on the windowsill, Hamish poured 2 generous measures. Jimmy took his gratefully and sank into the armchair by the fire. "Blair's convinced it's one of the locals," Jimmy said after his first sip. "He's already decided that Highland folk are all violent primitives who'd kill a man over an insult to their precious traditions." "And what do you think?" Jimmy shrugged. "I think whoever did it knew that hall inside and out. The way they navigated it in the dark knew exactly where that old peat cutter was kept. That takes familiarity. Any word from forensics?" "Nothing useful yet. No convenient fingerprints on the murder weapon. Plenty of boot prints near the back door, but it's been raining and half the village probably tramped through there at some point." Hamish refilled Jimmy's glass. "What about the autopsy?" "Preliminary report says death was more or less instantaneous. Single blow to the back of the head, delivered with considerable force. The angle suggests someone of average height, possibly a man, but not necessarily." "A strong woman could have managed it." Jimmy paused. "There's something else. The pathologist thinks Vane might have been kneeling when he was struck, as if he was looking for something on a lower shelf." That was interesting. Hamish filed it away with his other observations. "Blair mentioned a nephew," he said casually. "Anyone spoken to him?" "Callum Vane?" "Aye, we tracked him down in Edinburgh. Says he hadn't seen his uncle in months and has no interest in reconciliation or inheritance. Blair wants to haul him in anyway, but the man's got a solid alibi. Was at some casino in Edinburgh when the murder happened, and the security footage backs it up." They talked for another hour, Jimmy gradually relaxing as the whisky did its work. By the time he left, Hamish had learned that the Strathbane forensics team had found large muddy boot prints near the hall's rear entrance, that Blair was planning to make an arrest within 48 hours to satisfy the press, and that several villagers had already lawyered up rather than submit to Blair's aggressive questioning. Hamish sat by the fire after Jimmy had gone, Lugs snoring gently beside him, and Sonsi purring on his lap. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to emerge, but they didn't yet form a coherent picture. Vane had been asking questions about land and property. He had argued with a mysterious stranger by the harbour. He had antagonised half the village in the pub, and then someone had killed him in a locked room, using a weapon that was part of the local heritage display. The locked room bothered him more than anything else. It suggested premeditation, careful planning. This wasn't a crime of passion, someone lashing out in anger. This was calculated. He was mulling over these thoughts when there was a gentle knock at the door. He opened it to find Morag Menzies standing on the step, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "I'm so sorry to disturb you, Hamish," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right. It must have been dreadful finding that poor man." "Mrs. Wellington found him," Hamish corrected gently. "I just secured the scene." "Oh, of course. How silly of me." She smiled apologetically. "I suppose I'm a bit rattled by everything. It's not every day we have a murder in Loughdoob." "Would you like to come in for some tea?" "Oh no, I couldn't impose. I just wanted to—" She hesitated. "I've been thinking about something. It might be nothing, but you know how the village hall has all those old records in the storage area? Family histories, property deeds, that sort of thing?" Hamish nodded. "Well, there's always been talk about Jacobite gold being hidden somewhere in the village. Old stories, probably nonsense, but what if Mr. Vane heard those stories? What if he was looking for it when someone found him there? It was an interesting theory, and it would explain why Vane had been in the gear room. It would also suggest a transient thief rather than a local, which would take the pressure off the village." "That's worth considering," Hamish said. "Thank you, Morag." She smiled, looking relieved to have been helpful, and disappeared back into the darkening evening. Hamish closed the door and returned to his chair. A transient thief hunting for Jacobite gold. It was plausible, certainly. But something about it didn't quite ring true. He couldn't put his finger on what was bothering him, but experience had taught him to trust his instincts. And his instincts were telling him that Morag's helpful theory was just a little too convenient. Chapter 4. The Extortionist's Ledger. The full autopsy report arrived 2 days later, and Hamish learned of its contents through the simple expedient of inviting Jimmy Anderson for another evening of whisky and conversation. The detective inspector arrived looking haggard, having spent the intervening time conducting interviews under Blair's increasingly erratic direction. "The pathologist is certain it was no accident," Jimmy said, accepting his glass with visible relief. "The angle of the blow, the force required, the positioning of the body. Someone meant to kill Alistair Vane, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Time of death? Between 11 at night and 1 in the morning. Vane was last seen leaving the pub around 10:30, so that narrows it down a bit." Jimmy stretched his long legs towards the fire. "Blair's breathing down everyone's neck, demanding an arrest. He's convinced it's Archie McLean." Hamish looked up sharply. "Archie? What makes him think that?" "Those boot prints near the back entrance. Forensics matched them to a pair of Wellingtons found in Archie's shed. Big heavy things covered in mud and fish scales. Blair's practically salivating at the prospect of hauling him in." "Archie McLean wouldn't hurt a fly," Hamish protested. "Well, except flies. And fish, obviously, but not people. You and I know that, but Blair doesn't care. He wants someone in custody, and Archie's the easiest target." Jimmy sighed into his whisky. The man had a public row with Vane in the pub. Half the village heard him shouting about his harbour shed. Hamish's mind raced. He needed to find the real killer before Blair railroaded an innocent man into a cell. And to do that, he needed to understand what Vane had really been doing in Loughdoob. After Jimmy left, fortified by whisky and shepherd's pie, Hamish sat thinking. Vane had been researching property records. He had argued with a stranger by the harbour. He had threatened multiple villagers with legal action. None of this added up to a simple safety assessment. The next morning, Hamish took himself up to the cottage Vane had rented, a modern monstrosity on the hillside that belonged to a wealthy Glasgow businessman who used it perhaps twice a year. Blair's team had already searched it once, but Hamish had learned long ago that official searches often missed what was really important. The door was sealed with police tape, but Hamish had no compunction about breaking it. He was, after all, conducting his own investigation, and if Blair found out, well, that was a problem for later. The cottage was expensively furnished in the sort of anonymous modern style that suggested an interior designer rather than a human inhabitant. Hamish moved through the rooms methodically, looking for anything that might explain Vane's true purpose. He found it in the study, behind a row of leather-bound books that had clearly never been read. One of the spines was slightly askew, and when Hamish pulled it, the false front swung open to reveal a small walled safe. The safe wasn't locked. Either Blair's team had opened it and left it that way, or Vane had been remarkably careless about security. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, a laptop computer, and several bundles of cash. Hamish ignored the money and opened the ledger. What he found made his blood run cold. Alistair Vane hadn't been a safety consultant at all, or at least that had been merely a convenient cover. He was a land speculator, and a particularly nasty one. The ledger detailed a systematic scheme. Vane would pose as an official assessor, gain access to local records, and use the information to identify properties with clouded titles or disputed ownership. He would then approach the owners, threatening legal action unless they sold to him at a fraction of the market value. Page after page listed properties across the Highlands, along with the leverage Vane had discovered. Ancient debts, unclear inheritance lines, disputed boundaries, long-forgotten legal claims. Beside each entry was a note indicating whether the owner had capitulated or was in progress. Lochdoub had several entries. Archie McLean's harbour shed was there, with a note about an unpaid debt from Archie's grandfather dating back to the 1950s. Dr. Brodie's name appeared with a cryptic reference to Edinburgh Incident 1998. And there were others, shopkeepers, crofters, fishermen, all targeted by Vane's meticulous extortion. Hamish photographed each page with his mobile phone, his anger growing. This put an entirely new complexion on the case. Vane hadn't just been an irritating outsider. He had been actively threatening the livelihoods of Lochdoub's inhabitants. He was about to close the ledger when he noticed something else, a loose sheet tucked into the back cover. It was a photocopy of an old land registry document, he heavily annotated in Vane's handwriting. The property in question was the village hall itself, and the annotation suggested some sort of historical irregularity in its ownership. Hamish pocketed the document and carefully returned everything else to the safe, leaving no sign of his visit. As he walked back down the hill towards the village, his mind churned through possibilities. With this many people having reason to want Vane dead, the suspect pool had just expanded considerably. He was passing the Heritage Centre when Morag emerged carrying a large box of files. Hamish, just the person I wanted to see. She set the box down with evident relief. I've been going through the old records trying to compile a proper archive of village history. You wouldn't believe the state some of these documents are in. That's dedicated of you, Hamish said. Oh, it's a labour of love. This village has such a rich past and someone needs to preserve it properly. She smiled her gentle smile. I heard that dreadful Blair man is planning to arrest Archie. Surely that can't be right. I'm working on it, Hamish assured her. I'm so glad. Archie's a good soul, whatever his wife might say about him. She paused. You know, I've been thinking more about that Jacobite gold theory. I found a reference in one of the old documents to something being hidden in the hall during the clearances. It might be worth investigating. I'll keep it in mind, Hamish said, though his instincts were still telling him that Morag's helpful suggestions were leading him away from something rather than towards it. He watched her carry her box of files back into the Heritage Centre, then continued to the police station. Luggs greeted him with enthusiasm, and Sonsi deigned to open one eye from her position on the warmest chair. Hamish made himself a cup of tea and spread the photographs of Vane's ledger across his kitchen table. The web of extortion was extensive and clever. Vane had been very good at finding pressure points, at discovering the sort of historical irregularities that could tie people up in legal battles for years. The question was, which of his victims had finally decided that murder was preferable to financial ruin? Archie was the obvious suspect, especially with those boot prints. But Hamish knew the fisherman. Archie's solution to problems was to hide in the pub until they went away. He wasn't the confrontational type. and he certainly wasn't the calculating type who could plan a locked-room murder. Dr. Brodie was more promising. The reference to an Edinburgh incident suggested something serious enough to threaten his medical licence. A doctor would have the knowledge to strike a killing blow with precision. But then there was the mysterious younger man the Curry sisters had seen arguing with Vane. If that was Callum Vane, the nephew, then Jimmy's mention of casino security footage proved he couldn't have done it. Unless, of course, there was a second stranger in the village. Hamish rubbed his eyes, feeling the familiar frustration of a case with too many possibilities and not enough facts. What he needed was to narrow down the suspect pool to find something that would point definitively in one direction. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Wellington, looking unusually flustered. "Hamish, thank goodness you're here. It's Archie. Blair's men just arrested him. They've taken him to Strathbane." Hamish swore under his breath. Blair was moving faster than he had expected. Did Archie say anything? Only that he didn't do it and he needed a lawyer. Mrs. Wellington wrung her hands. His wife is beside herself. Well, beside herself with anger at him for getting arrested, which is typical of her, but still. Hamish grabbed his jacket. He needed to get to Strathbane and speak to Archie before Blair extracted some sort of coerced confession. But more than that, he needed to find the real killer. Because one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Whoever had murdered Alistair Vane had done it with careful premeditation, and they had no intention of being caught. Chapter 5. Expanding the Suspect Pool. The drive to Strathbane took Hamish through increasingly dismal countryside as the wild beauty of the Highlands gave way to industrial greyness. He had always thought of Strathbane as a sort of purgatory, a place where ambition went to die and police careers were measured in paperwork rather than actual results. The police station was a brutal concrete building that looked like it had been designed to crush the human spirit, and probably had been. Hamish found Jimmy Anderson in the canteen, hunched over a mug of tea that looked strong enough to strip paint. "They won't let you see him," Jimmy said before Hamish could even ask. "Blair's orders, no contact with the suspect until after the interrogation." Has Archie lawyered up? "Aye, some fellow from Inverness. Decent sort. He won't let Blair bully him too badly." Jimmy rubbed his face. "The evidence is circumstantial, but Blair's making it sound like we caught Archie standing over the body with the murder weapon in his hands." "What about motive?" "The harbour shed. Vane was threatening to seize it over some ancient debt. Archie had a very public row with him about it in the pub." Jimmy lowered his voice. "Between you and me, Hamish, I don't think Archie did it. The man can barely organise his fishing tackle, let alone commit a calculated murder, but Blair wants an arrest, and Archie's convenient." Hamish felt his frustration mounting. He needed to prove Archie's innocence, which meant finding the real killer, and to do that, he needed to understand who else had been threatened by Vane's extortion scheme. "Jimmy, has anyone looked into Vane's background? His business dealings, his associates?" "There's a nephew, Callum Vane, lives in Edinburgh. Works in finance, apparently, though not very successfully. He's up to his eyes in gambling debts." The Curry sisters saw Vane arguing with a younger man by the harbour the day before he died. Jimmy's eyes sharpened. "Did they now? That's interesting. We should bring this Callum in for questioning." "I thought you said he had an alibi." "He does. Casino security footage shows him at the tables in Edinburgh when Vane was killed. But that doesn't mean he wasn't in Lockdoob earlier that day." Jimmy drained his tea. "I'll make some calls, see what I can dig up about young Callum." Hamish drove back to Lockdoob feeling marginally more hopeful. If Callum Vane had come looking for his uncle, demanding money or inheritance, that opened up new possibilities. The nephew might not have wielded the murder weapon himself, but that didn't mean he wasn't involved somehow. He arrived back in the village to find it in a state of barely controlled outrage. News of Archie's arrest had spread, and the locals were furious at what they saw as typical Strathbane heavy-handedness. The Curry sisters accosted him the moment he stepped out of his Land Rover. "It's a disgrace," Nessie declared. "A disgrace?" Jessie echoed. "Archie McLean couldn't murder anyone." "Couldn't murder anyone? He's too scared of his wife to murder anyone," Nessie added with brutal Highland logic. Hamish promised to do what he could and made his escape before the sisters could work themselves into a proper frenzy. He needed to think. And he couldn't do that with the entire village demanding immediate action. Back at the police station, he spread out his notes and the photographs of Vane's ledger. The web of potential suspects was daunting. In addition to Archie, there was Dr. Brodie with his mysterious Edinburgh incident, several shopkeepers facing financial ruin, and now Callum Vane with his gambling debts and possible inheritance motive. He was still mulling over the possibilities when there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Dr. Brodie standing on the step, looking decidedly uncomfortable. "Hamish, might I have a word?" "Of course, come in." The doctor entered, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his hands. He was a slight man in his late 50s, with thinning grey hair and the permanently worried expression of someone who had seen too much suffering. "It's about that ledger of Vane's," he said without preamble. "I understand you found it." Hamish said nothing, waiting. "There was an entry about me, about Edinburgh." Dr. Brodie sank into a chair. "I suppose you'll be wanting to know what that was all about." "Only if it's relevant to the investigation." The doctor smiled wryly. "You're a good man, Hamish. Better than most in your position would be. But I'd rather tell you myself than have you hear it from Blair's interrogations." He took a deep breath. "In 1998, I was working at the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh. I made a mistake during a routine procedure. The patient survived, but there were complications. I was investigated, cleared of any criminal wrongdoing, but the guilt has never left me. I came to Lochdew partly to escape that memory, and Vane found out. Medical records are supposed to be confidential, but Vane had his ways. He threatened to report me to the medical board, to drag the whole sorry business up again. He wanted me to sell him my cottage at a fraction of its value, or he'd make sure every patient in the Highlands knew about my incompetence." The doctor's hands clenched. "I won't pretend I didn't hate him for it. But I didn't kill him. Where were you on the night he died?" "Playing cards with Reverend Wellington and 2 of the church elders. We meet every Tuesday evening. Ask anyone, they'll confirm it." Hamish made a note. The Reverend was many things, but he wasn't a liar. If he said Dr. Brodie was with him, then that was almost certainly true. "Thank you for telling me," Hamish said. Dr. Brodie stood to leave, then paused. "Hamish, there's something else. Professional confidence prevents me from being specific, but you should know that Vane was asking questions about more than just property and debts. He was digging into people's medical histories, their personal lives. He was a thoroughly nasty piece of work, and I suspect there are secrets in this village that even you don't know about." After the doctor left, Hamish sat thinking. The case was becoming more complex by the hour. Vane hadn't just been extorting property. He had been collecting information about people's private lives, their mistakes and indiscretions. His mobile phone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson. "Hamish, I've got news about Callum Vane. Interesting fellow. He's been trying to get money out of his uncle for months, sent increasingly desperate letters, made threats, the lot. We found copies of the correspondence in Vane's cottage." "What sort of threats?" "The usual. You'll regret this. You owe me," that sort of thing. Nothing overtly violent, but the tone got nastier with each letter. Jimmy paused. "Here's the thing. Callum Vane arrived in Lochdew 3 days before the murder. Stayed at a bed and breakfast in Strathbane and drove up each day. The Curry sisters were right about seeing an argument by the harbour. But he was in Edinburgh when Vane died. So the casino footage says. He left Lochdew around 8 that evening and drove straight to Edinburgh, arrived at the casino around 11:30 and stayed until 4 in the morning," Jimmy sighed. "So unless he can teleport, he didn't kill his uncle, but he was definitely demanding money, probably trying to claim some sort of early inheritance." Hamish thanked him and rang off. So Callum Vane was another dead end, despite the promising motive. The nephew had needed money desperately, but he had been miles away when his uncle was killed. He was about to make himself some dinner when Morag Menzies appeared at the door yet again, this time carrying a casserole dish. "I thought you might be too busy to cook," she said, smiling apologetically. "It's just a simple lamb stew, nothing fancy." Hamish accepted it gratefully, though part of his mind registered that this was becoming a pattern. Morag was always there, always helpful, always anticipating needs before they were expressed. "Any progress on the case?" she asked, hovering in the doorway. "These things take time," Hamish said vaguely. "Of course. I just worry about poor Archie, locked up in that dreadful Strathbane jail." She clasped her hands. "You know, I was thinking about the village hall records again. That document about the ownership irregularity. It might be worth looking into more thoroughly. What if that's what got Vane killed?" "What sort of irregularity?" Hamish asked, suddenly alert. "Oh, I'd have to check the details. Something about the transfer of ownership during the 1960s. Probably nothing important, but you never know." She smiled again. "Well, I won't keep you from your dinner. I just wanted to make sure you were looking after yourself." After she left, Hamish sat at his kitchen table, the stew cooling in front of him. Morag kept pointing him towards the village hall records, towards historical irregularities and Jacobite gold and property transfers. And that, Hamish was increasingly certain, meant the answer lay somewhere in that direction. The question was Morag trying to help him find the truth, or was she trying to ensure he looked everywhere except where the truth actually resided? Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. Hamish spent the following day doing what Blair would have considered absolutely nothing productive. He walked his beat through the village, stopped for tea with various residents, and generally gave the impression of a man who had given up on solving the case and resigned himself to letting Strathbane handle everything. In reality, he was listening to the gossip that flowed through Lochdoub like water through a burn, picking up fragments of information that no formal investigation would ever uncover. By late afternoon, he had learned that Archie's wife had visited him in jail and spent the entire time berating him for the inconvenience his arrest had caused her. He had also learned that Callum Vane had been seen in the village on at least 3 separate occasions, always asking questions about his uncle's business affairs. And he had learned that Dr. Brodie's card game with the Reverend Wellington was a well-established Tuesday tradition, which gave the doctor a solid alibi that would satisfy even Blair's suspicious mind. He was walking back towards the police station as dusk began to settle over the village, when he noticed a figure moving furtively near the village hall. The person was carrying something bulky wrapped in what looked like burlap sacking, and was moving with the exaggerated stealth of someone who didn't want to be seen. Hamish's police instincts, which had been lying dormant like lugs on a warm afternoon, suddenly sprang to life. He moved quietly through the gathering darkness, keeping to the shadows until he could identify the figure. It was Dr. Brodie. The doctor was heading away from the hall towards the woods that bordered the village, his burden clearly heavy judging by the way he was walking. Hamish followed at a discreet distance, his mind racing. Had he been wrong about Brodie? Was the card game alibi false? Was the mild-mannered physician actually capable of murder after all? The woods were dark and silent except for the sound of Brodie's laboured breathing. The doctor stopped in a small clearing, set down his burden, and began to dig a hole with a small spade he had brought with him. Hamish waited until the hole was complete, and Brodie was about to lower the sack into it before stepping forward. "Evening, Doctor." Brodie spun around, his face pale in the moonlight. For a moment he looked terrified, then his shoulders sagged in defeat. "Oh God, Hamish. This isn't what it looks like." "And what does it look like?" "Murder evidence, I suppose." The doctor gave a hollow laugh. "But it's not. I swear to you it's not." "Then what's in the sack?" Brodie hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. He opened the burlap to reveal the remains of a large salmon, partially gutted and very definitely illegal. "I was fishing," he admitted miserably. "Night fishing, without a permit. Caught this beauty 2 nights ago, but Mrs. Brodie found it in the shed this morning. She went absolutely spare, started going on about how I'd bring disgrace on the family, how the whole village would know I was a poacher." He looked at Hamish pleadingly. "I panicked. I thought if I just buried it, no one would be the wiser." Hamish looked at the fish, then at the doctor's anguished face, and felt the tension drain out of him. This was pure farce, not murder. A respected physician reduced to burying salmon in the woods to avoid his wife's wrath. Mrs. Brodie doesn't know you're out here? She thinks I'm doing house calls. She'll kill me if she finds out I'm still poaching after I promised I'd stop. The doctor actually wrung his hands. Hamish, please. I know it's illegal, but it's just one fish. I wasn't selling them or anything. It's just, well, old habits die hard. Hamish considered the situation. Strictly speaking, he should confiscate the salmon and issue a citation. But Highland tradition ran deeper than the letter of the law, and night fishing was a custom that went back centuries. More importantly, hauling doctor. Brodie up on poaching charges would accomplish nothing except making an enemy of the village physician and destroying the delicate social fabric that held Lochdoub together. I never saw you, Hamish said finally, and you never saw me. But doctor, for God's sake, stick to legal fishing from now on. Your nerves can't take this sort of thing. The relief on Brodie's face was almost comical. Bless you, Hamish. I mean it. I won't forget this. Just make sure your card games with the Reverend are genuine, Hamish said, because if Blair finds out I've been covering for you, he'll have both our heads. The card game is completely legitimate. I was there all evening on Tuesday from 8 until well past midnight. Ask any of the elders who were playing with us. Hamish watched as the doctor hurriedly buried his contraband salmon and scurried back towards the village. He stood in the clearing for a moment, breathing in the cold night air and feeling slightly foolish. He had been so certain he was about to break the case wide open, and instead he had discovered nothing more sinister than an embarrassed physician hiding evidence of poaching. Still, the alibi was confirmed. Dr. Brodie hadn't killed Vane. He was walking back towards the village when his mobile phone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson, and he sounded excited. Hamish, we've got something. Blair's fit to burst with it. What? Those boot prints near the hall, we traced them definitively to Archie's Wellingtons. But here's the interesting bit. There's mud in the treads that matches soil samples from the harbour area, and fish scales embedded in the rubber. The forensics team says the boots were definitely at the murder scene. That doesn't prove Archie was wearing them, Hamish pointed out. No, but Blair's not interested in fine distinctions. He's preparing to charge Archie formally. Jimmy lowered his voice. Between you and me, the case is weak. Any decent lawyer will tear it apart. But Blair's under pressure from upstairs and he's desperate for a conviction. Can you stall him? I can try, but not for long. If you're going to prove Archie's innocence, you need to do it soon. After Jimmy rang off, Hamish stood in the darkness, thinking. The boot prints were troubling. They placed Archie's Wellingtons at the scene. But Wellingtons could be borrowed or stolen. Half the fishermen in Lochdoub had similar boots, and they all looked more or less identical. He needed to verify Archie's actual whereabouts on the night of the murder. The man claimed he had been hiding in the pub cellar to avoid his wife, but Hamish needed confirmation. The pub was still open when he arrived, a warm glow of light spilling out onto the dark street. The barman, a taciturn fellow named Donald, was wiping down glasses with methodical precision. Donald, I need to ask you about Tuesday night. The night Vane was killed. Donald continued wiping. What about it? Was Archie here? Aye. Came in around 9, left around closing time. All evening? Well, not exactly. Donald set down his glass. He was hiding in the cellar for most of it. His wife had been on the warpath about something, and Archie said he needed to make himself scarce. He does that sometimes when things get too heated at home. Can anyone else confirm this? I can, said a voice from the corner. Old Angus MacDonald emerged from the shadows, a half-empty whiskey glass in his hand. I was playing dominoes with Dougie Fraser that night. Went down to the cellar around 10 to fetch up another crate of ale, and there was Archie, sitting on a barrel and reading an old newspaper by candlelight. Looked like a sad little gnome, he did. What time did he leave the cellar? Must have been near midnight. I saw him creep up the stairs and slip out the back way, trying to avoid notice, probably hoping his wife would be asleep by the time he got home. Hamish felt a surge of relief. If Archie had been in the pub cellar until midnight, he couldn't have killed Vane. The pathologist had placed the time of death between 11 and 1 o'clock, but the logistics of getting from the pub cellar to the village hall, committing murder, and escaping from a locked room would have been virtually impossible in that time frame. Thanks, Angus. Donald. You may have just saved an innocent man from prison. He left the pub feeling cautiously optimistic for the first time since the investigation began. Archie had an alibi, even if it was the rather pathetic one of hiding from his wife in a pub cellar. But that still left the central question. If Archie didn't kill Vane, who did? And how did they manage to escape from a locked room? As he walked back to the police station, Hamish's mind kept returning to one person, Morag Menzies. Sweet, helpful Morag, who always seemed to be around, always offering assistance, always pointing him towards historical documents and property irregularities. It was time, Hamish decided, to stop being diverted by false trails and red herrings. It was time to look very carefully at the woman who seemed most determined to be helpful. Because in his experience, the person who tried hardest to assist the investigation was often the person with the most to hide. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, the kind of Highland winter day where the frost never quite melted, and every breath felt like inhaling knives. Hamish fed Lugs and Sonsy, made himself a pot of strong coffee, and settled down to the methodical work of eliminating suspects. He telephoned Jimmy Anderson first thing, catching the detective before Blair could rope him into another round of pointless interrogations. "Jimmy, I need you to do something for me without telling Blair." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm listening." "Archie's alibi. I've got 2 witnesses who place him in the pub cellar until midnight. I need you to verify the timeline against the pathologist's report." "Hang on." Hamish heard the rustle of papers. "Right. Yeah, time of death was between 11 at night and 1 in the morning, with the pathologist favouring the earlier end of that window based on body temperature and rigor mortis. If Archie was in the pub until midnight, he couldn't have done it. Not enough time to get to the hall, commit the murder and set up that locked room scenario." Jimmy was quiet for a moment. "Blair's not going to like this." "Blair doesn't have to like it. He just has to release an innocent man. I'll see what I can do. But Hamish, if Archie's boots were at the scene, someone else must have worn them, or at least someone else must have been there who had access to them. That was the problem, wasn't it? The boots pointed to Archie, but Archie couldn't have been wearing them, which meant someone had either borrowed them or deliberately planted evidence to implicate the fisherman. After he rang off with Jimmy, Hamish pulled out his notes and began to systematically review every suspect. Dr. Brodie had a solid alibi, playing cards with the Reverend and the church elders, multiple witnesses, all of them respectable men who had no reason to lie. That eliminated the doctor. Callum Vane had been desperate for money and had argued with his uncle, but the casino footage placed him in Edinburgh at the time of the murder. The nephew had opportunity before the killing, but not during it. That eliminated Callum. Archie McLean had motive, means, and his boots had been at the scene, but he had been hiding in a pub cellar. 2 witnesses confirmed it, and the timeline didn't work. That eliminated Archie, which left a village full of people who had been threatened by Vane's extortion scheme, any one of whom might have decided that murder was preferable to financial ruin. Hamish rubbed his eyes. He needed to think about this differently. The locked room wasn't just a puzzle. It was a message. The killer wanted it to look impossible, wanted to create confusion and misdirection. That suggested someone intelligent, someone who understood how investigations worked. Someone like an archivist who spent her days organising historical documents and understanding how information could be manipulated. He was still mulling over this thought when there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find the Curry sisters standing on his step, both looking unusually serious. "Hamish, we need to talk to you," Nessie said. "Talk to you," Jessie echoed. Come in. They settled themselves in his small sitting room, perched on the edge of the sofa like birds ready to take flight. Lugs immediately went to them, hoping for treats, while Sonsy watched from her perch with feline disdain. "It's about that young man," Nessie began. "The one we saw arguing with Vane." "The one by the harbour," Jessie added. "You said he had dark hair and an expensive coat." "Expensive coat," Jessie confirmed. "Well, we've been thinking about it, and we realised we'd seen him before, earlier that week." Earlier that week, Hamish pulled out his notebook. Where did you see him? Outside the Heritage Centre, Nessie said, talking to Morag Menzies. That brought Hamish up short. You're certain? Absolutely certain. Absolutely certain. We thought it was odd at the time. Morag talking to a strange young man, but we assumed he was doing research or something. People do come to use the archive sometimes. Sometimes. Did you hear what they were talking about? Both sisters shook their heads in unison. Too far away, but Morag looked upset, not her usual calm self at all. After the sisters left, Hamish sat thinking. Morag had been talking to Callum Vane before the murder. She had never mentioned knowing him. In fact, when Hamish had discussed the nephew, Morag had said nothing about having met him. Why would she conceal that connection? He decided it was time to do some digging into Morag's background. She had been in Lochdoub for years, ever since she'd moved from somewhere in Sutherland after her parents died. Everyone knew her as the sweet, just helpful archivist who devoted her life to preserving the village's history. But what had her life been like before she came to Lochdoub? Hamish spent the afternoon on the telephone calling in favours from other constables across the Highlands, checking records, following paper trails. What he discovered was illuminating. Morag Menzies had been born Morag MacLeod in a small village near Tongue in Sutherland. Her parents had owned a successful business until a land deal went sour in the early 1980s. They had been bankrupted by a developer from London, lost everything, and her father had subsequently taken his own life. Morag had been 15 at the time. The developer's name was Martin Vane, Alistair Vane's father. Hamish sat back, his mind racing. This changed everything. Morag had a personal connection to Vane, a deep and painful one. The man who had destroyed her family was the father of the man she had helped investigate for murder. But was it enough for murder? Revenge for something that had happened 40 years ago? He needed to see the village hall records for himself, particularly those documents about the ownership irregularity that Morag kept mentioning. He had a growing suspicion that the hall itself was at the centre of this whole affair. The Heritage Centre was closed when he arrived, but Hamish had a key. As the village constable, he had access to most buildings in case of emergency, and this qualified. Inside, the centre smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Morag kept everything meticulously organised, with displays showing Highland life through the centuries and carefully preserved documents in acid-free folders. Hamish made his way to the archive room at the back and began searching through the property records. It took him nearly an hour to find what he was looking for, the documents relating to the village hall's ownership history. The hall had originally been a private home, built in the 1850s by a family called MacLeod, the same family name as Morag's maiden name. The house had passed through several generations until the 1980s, when it had been seized by creditors following the bankruptcy of the owners. The creditors had sold it to the village council for a nominal sum, and it had been converted into a community hall. But there was something else in the file, a small notation that made Hamish's blood run cold. According to the original deeds, the MacLeod family had hidden certain valuables in the house before it was seized, including several pieces of jewellery and some historical documents that they considered priceless family heirlooms. The creditors had never found them. The village council had never found them. But if someone who knew the house intimately, someone who had lived there as a child, were to search carefully. Hamish remembered what Jimmy had said about Vane being found kneeling, as if he had been searching for something on a lower shelf. He had been searching for the MacLeod family treasures, and Morag had stopped him. The pieces were finally falling into place. Morag's overly helpful behaviour, her suggestions about Jacobite gold and transient thieves, her failure to mention meeting Callum Vane. She had been steering the investigation away from herself while hiding in plain sight behind her gentle demeanour. Hamish carefully photographed the documents with his phone and replaced everything exactly as he'd found it. He needed more proof before he could confront her, something concrete that would tie her to the murder scene. He was about to leave when he noticed something on the workbench where Morag restored old documents. There were bottles of archival glue, sheets of vintage vellum, specialist tools for paper conservation. and stuck to the edge of the workbench, so small he almost missed it, was a tiny scrap of vellum with a distinctive texture. Hamish carefully collected it in an evidence bag, his mind working furiously. If he could match this to the scrap found at the murder scene, he would have physical evidence placing Morag at the hall when Vane died. He locked up the Heritage Centre and walked back through the dark village. Tomorrow he would need to go to Strathbane to check the forensics reports and see if his suspicions were correct. But tonight he allowed himself to feel a grim satisfaction. The killer had been clever, had played her role perfectly, had almost gotten away with it. Almost. But Hamish Macbeth hadn't become the best constable in Sutherland by accepting things at face value, and he had no intention of letting a murderer, however sympathetic their motive, escape justice. Chapter 8. The Archivist's Flaw. Hamish arrived at Strathbane Police Headquarters early the next morning, before Blair could begin his daily routine of drinking coffee and shouting at subordinates. He found Jimmy Anderson in the forensics lab, looking over a stack of reports with bleary eyes. "You look terrible," Hamish observed. "Thank you for that. I've been here since 6, trying to make sense of Blair's mess." Jimmy gestured at the papers. "The man's like a tornado in a filing cabinet. Nothing's where it should be. I need to see the evidence from the murder scene, specifically anything found that didn't belong there." Jimmy rummaged through her evidence locker and produced a sealed bag. "There's not much. Some mud, fibres from clothing, and this." He held up a smaller bag containing a tiny scrap of what looked like old paper. "The forensics team found it near where the body was lying. It's some kind of vintage vellum, the sort used in old documents. No idea what it was doing there." Hamish pulled out his own evidence bag containing the scrap he had found in the Heritage Centre. "What if I told you I might have a match?" Jimmy's eyes widened. "Where did you get that?" "Morag Menzies' workbench. She restores old documents as part of her archival work." "That's not enough for an arrest. Defence would argue it could have been transferred innocently, that she works in the hall all the time." "I know, but there's more." Hamish laid out everything he had discovered. Morag's true identity as a MacLeod, the bankruptcy of her parents, Martin Vane's role in their destruction, that of the village hall being her ancestral home, and the hidden family treasures. Jimmy listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "So you think Vane discovered all this while researching property records?" "I think he realised exactly who Morag was and what the hall meant to her. I think he was threatening to expose the hidden artefacts as stolen property, which would destroy her reputation and any claim she might have to them." Hamish paused. "But I need more proof. Specifically, I need to know if there's anything in the timeline that doesn't match up with what Morag told Blair." Jimmy pulled out another file. "Here's the statement she gave. Says she was home all evening on Tuesday, didn't hear or see anything unusual, claimed she found out about the murder the next morning when Mrs. Wellington raised the alarm. What about the list she gave Blair? The one with everyone who had argued with Vane?" "It's here somewhere." Jimmy shuffled through papers. "Aye, here it is. Very thorough, very detailed. Notes about who said what, who threatened what." He frowned. "Actually, Hamish, there's something odd about this." "What?" "She mentions a specific historical deed that Vane was supposedly researching. Says he was asking questions about a property transfer in 1963. Jimmy checked another document, but according to the Heritage Centre's own records, that particular deed was destroyed in a fire in 1972. Morag herself filed the report noting its loss. There it was, the tiny flaw in Morag's carefully constructed facade. She had included a detail that couldn't possibly be true, and only someone with intimate knowledge of the archives would have caught it. "She was testing Blair," Hamish said slowly, "seeing if he was competent enough to notice the inconsistency. When he didn't, she knew she could feed him whatever narrative she wanted." "That's cold," Jimmy said. "That's really cold." Hamish thought about the sweet-faced woman who brought him scones and casseroles, who always seemed so concerned about everyone's welfare, the perfect mask for someone planning murder. "Jimmy, I need you to check one more thing. When did Callum Vane arrive in the area, and did he have any contact with Morag before his uncle died?" It took 20 minutes of digging through interviews and hotel records, but Jimmy finally found it. Callum checked into a bed and breakfast in Strathbane 5 days before the murder. The landlady says he mentioned he was meeting someone in Lochdoub about family business, but he didn't say who. The Curry sisters saw him talking to Morag outside the Heritage Centre. She never mentioned it. Jimmy sat back. So she knew the nephew was in the area, demanding money from his uncle. She knew Callum would make a perfect suspect, or at least a useful distraction. He shook his head. Hamish, this is all circumstantial. We've got a scrap of vellum that might match, a false detail in a witness statement, and a connection she didn't disclose. A good lawyer would tear it apart. I know. That's why I need to talk to her. Get her to reveal something that only the killer would know. Blair will have your head if you interrogate a witness without authorization. Then Blair won't know about it until after. Hamish stood up. Can you buy me some time? Keep Blair busy with Archie's release paperwork? I can do that. But Hamish, be careful. If she killed once, she might kill again to protect herself. Hamish drove back to Lochdoub through the winter landscape, his mind working through how to approach Morag. He couldn't just accuse her directly. She was too smart for that, too controlled. He needed to find the crack in her armour, the one thing that would make her drop her gentle facade. He found her at the Heritage Centre as he knew he would. She was arranging a new display about traditional Highland farming methods, her movements precise and careful. Hamish, she smiled warmly when she saw him. What a lovely surprise. I was just about to make some tea. Actually, Morag, I was hoping you could help me with something. Some questions about the village hall's history. Of course, that's what I'm here for. She led him to a small office at the back, gesturing for him to sit. What would you like to know? I've been looking into the hall's ownership records. Fascinating stuff. Did you know it used to be a private home? Oh yes, the MacLeod house. Built in the 1850s, quite a grand place in its day. The MacLeods lost it in the 1980s, didn't they? Bankruptcy. Something flickered in Morag's eyes, too quick to identify. That's right. Very sad story. The developer who took it from them was quite ruthless, I understand. Martin Vane, Hamish said, watching her carefully. Was it? I don't recall the name. But her hand, reaching for the teapot, trembled slightly, just as it had at the murder scene. Strange, Hamish continued conversationally. Because you mentioned a DCI Blair that Alistair Vane was researching a specific deed from 1963, but that deed was destroyed in a fire in 1972. You filed the report yourself. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Morag's hand had frozen in mid-air, and when she finally lowered it, all pretense of warmth had vanished from her face. You're cleverer than you look, Hamish Macbeth. And you're more dangerous than you appear, Morag MacLeod. She didn't correct the name. Instead, she sank into a chair across from him, her back straight, her expression no longer gentle but hard as Highland granite. I suppose you've worked it all out. Most of it. The hall was your family home. Martin Vane destroyed your parents. His son came here decades later, found out who you were, and threatened to expose the family treasures you'd hidden, treasures that legally belonged to the creditors, not to you. Hamish leaned forward. So you killed him, used your knowledge of the hall to make it look like an impossible crime, planted evidence to point at Archie, and hid behind your reputation as the helpful village archivist. You can't prove any of that. The vellum scrap at the scene matches the materials you use. You lied about the 1963 deed. You never mentioned meeting Callum Vane, which suggests you were already planning to use him as a diversion. Hamish paused. And you knew details about the case that only the killer would know, like the fact that Vane was kneeling when he died, searching for something on a lower shelf. Morag's composure cracked slightly. I never said that. No. But you suggested he was looking for Jacobite gold. How did you know he was looking for anything at all unless you were there when he died? For a long moment she said nothing. Then, slowly, she began to laugh. It was not a pleasant sound. Do you know what it's like, Hamish? To lose everything when you're 15 years old? To watch your father hang himself in the barn because he couldn't bear the shame of bankruptcy? Her voice was cold, controlled. Martin Vane did that, and his son was exactly the same. A predator who destroyed lives for profit. So you took revenge. I took back what was mine. She stood, moving to the window. That hall belonged to my family for 5 generations. Those treasures were ours, and that monster was going to take them away again, just like his father did. Murder is still murder. Ah, Morag. She turned to face him, and in her eyes was something implacable and ancient. Is it? Or is it justice, 40 years delayed? Chapter 9. Sins of the Past. Hamish remained seated, keeping his voice calm and level. Why don't you tell me what really happened, Morag? From the beginning. She studied him for a long moment, then returned to her chair. When she spoke, her voice had lost its usual softness. It was harder now, edged with bitterness that had been hidden for decades. I was born in that house, the village hall, as you call it now. My family had owned it for generations. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, respectable. She stared at her hands. My father was a good man. Too good, really. Too trusting. When Martin Vane came up from London with his promises of investment and partnership, my father believed every word. What happened? A land deal. Vane convinced my father to put up the house as collateral for a development scheme. Told him they'd make a fortune, that the Highlands were the next big opportunity for property investors. Her laugh was bitter. It was fraud, of course. Vane had no intention of honouring the partnership. He structured it so that when the scheme collapsed, my father was left holding all the debt while Vane walked away clean. Hamish had seen it before. Highland folk, with their old-fashioned sense of honour and their dislike of written contracts, were easy prey for sophisticated con-men from the south. The creditors took everything. The house, the land, even my mother's jewellery. All of it gone to pay debts that weren't really ours. Morag's voice hardened. My father couldn't bear it. A week after we were evicted, he hanged himself in a friend's barn. My mother died 6 months later. They said it was pneumonia, but I knew better. She died of a broken heart. And you came to Lockdow? Years later, yes. I'd been living in Inverness, working in libraries and archives. When I heard the village was looking for someone to manage their heritage centre, I applied. I changed my surname to my mother's maiden name, Menzies. No one here remembered the MacLeods who had lost everything all those years ago. She met his eyes. I wanted to be close to my family home, to preserve what remained of our history. Is that so terrible? No, Hamish said quietly, but murder is. Morag stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a folder of old photographs. She spread them on the desk. Pictures of a grand Highland house, of a smiling family, of a young girl with dark braids standing in a garden. This was my home. This was my life. She tapped one photograph. That's me at 13, before everything fell apart. Do you know what I became after? An orphan, shuttled between distant relatives who didn't want me, working from the age of 16 to support myself. Her voice shook with controlled rage. Martin Vane destroyed my family, and when his son came here, poking into property records, I knew he was cut from the same cloth. When did you realise who Alistair Vane was? About a week before he died. He came to the Heritage Centre, all smiles and professional courtesy, asking to see historical property records. Said he was doing research for his assessment. She sorted through more papers. I didn't recognise the name at first. Vane is common enough. But then he made a comment about his father having business interests in the Highlands in the 1980s. The way he said it, with that smug satisfaction, I knew. Did you confront him? Not immediately. I went home and dug out my mother's old papers, found the legal documents from the bankruptcy, Martin Vane's signature on everything. Then I did some research of my own, discovered that Alistair was running the same sorts of schemes his father had, just with a modern veneer of corporate legitimacy. She closed the folder. I realised he was here to prey on Lockdow just as his father had preyed on us. So you decided to kill him? I decided to protect what was mine, her eyes flashed. Before the bankruptcy, my father hid some family treasures in the house. Jewellery that had belonged to my grandmother, old documents, a few valuable books. He built a hiding place in the gear room behind a false panel. The creditors never found it. And neither did the village council when they converted the building. But Vane found it. He was thorough, I'll give him that. He'd worked out who I was, realised the hall had been my home, and guessed that something might be hidden there. On Tuesday evening, after his performance at the pub, he sent me a message. Said we needed to talk about mutual interests. She practically spat the words. I met him at the hall around 11:30. He was already in the gear room, searching. He'd found the hiding place. Hamish could picture it. The quiet archivist arriving at the darkened hall, finding Vane kneeling by the hiding place, rifling through her family's treasures. He laughed when he saw me. Actually laughed. Said the jewellery would fetch a decent price, that he was entitled to it as compensation for my father's debts. Said if I tried to stop him, he'd report me to the police for concealing stolen property. Morag's hands clenched. Those weren't stolen. They were my grandmother's, my mother's. They were all I had left of my family. So you struck him. The old peat cutter was part of the display I'd arranged. Heavy iron, solid. I picked it up and I hit him. Once. That's all it took. There was no remorse in her voice, only cold satisfaction. He died instantly. No suffering, which was more mercy than his father showed mine. And the locked room? That wasn't as clever as it seemed. I locked the window from the inside before I struck him, and I left through the door, locking it from the outside with my key. The window made it look impossible, but it was just misdirection. She smiled thinly. I learned from the best. Vane himself taught me how to manipulate records, how to create false trails. I just applied those lessons to murder. The boots, Hamish said. Archie's boots. I borrowed them from his shed the night before, wore them to the hall, then returned them. I knew Blair would jump on the first piece of physical evidence he found. Her expression was contemptuous. Your detective chief inspector is exactly the sort of bully who goes after the weakest target. I counted on that. Hamish thought of poor Archie, arrested and terrified simply because Morag had needed a scapegoat. And the helpful suggestions, the Jacobite gold, the transient thief, leading you away from the truth, or so I thought. She looked at him with something almost like respect. I underestimated you, Hamish. You seemed so lazy. Were you so content to let Blair handle everything? I didn't realise you were actually investigating properly. The vellum gave you away, and the false detail about the 1963 deed. Careless of me. I was testing Blair's competence, and I forgot that someone else might check. She stood, straightening her cardigan with deliberate precision. Well, Constable Macbeth, what happens now? You can't prove any of this. It's my word against yours, and I've been the helpful witness throughout. You just confessed to me, did I? Or did we just have a conversation about historical injustices? Her smile was cold. I'm not foolish enough to sign anything or repeat this in front of witnesses. Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out his mobile phone. The recording app showed it had been running since before he entered the Heritage Centre. Highland law is old-fashioned in many ways, Morag, but technology has caught up with us. Every word you've said has been recorded. For the first time, genuine emotion crossed her face. Not fear, but rage. You had no right. I had every right. I'm investigating a murder. Hamish stood. Morag MacLeod, I'm arresting you for the murder of Alistair Vane. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt that will help you now. She didn't resist when he produced his handcuffs. Instead, she looked at him with an expression of profound contempt. He deserved it. They both deserved it. The Vanes destroyed my family and felt no remorse. I've spent 40 years living in the shadow of what they did. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty. But I'm not sorry, Hamish. I'd do it again. As he led her out of the Heritage Centre, the winter sun was setting over Lochdew, painting the loch in shades of gold and crimson. Villagers stopped and stared as the gentle archivist was led to Hamish's Land Rover in handcuffs, their faces reflecting shock and disbelief. Mrs. Wellington stood in the doorway of the kirk, her hand over her mouth. The Curry sisters clutched each other in astonishment. Even old Angus MacDonald, who claimed to have foreseen the murder, looked genuinely surprised. Hamish helped Morag into the vehicle, his mind already working through what would come next. The confession, the trial, the inevitable questions about why someone so apparently kind could commit such a calculated murder. But as he drove towards Strathbane, he found himself thinking not about justice, but about the long shadow that old sins cast across generations. Martin Vane had destroyed the MacLeod family 40 years ago, and his son had paid the price for that cruelty. It was, Hamish reflected, a very Highland sort of tragedy. Chapter 10, The Lazy Constable's Justice. The Strathbane police station was in an uproar when Hamish arrived with Morag in custody. DCI Blair, who had been preparing to formally charge Archie MacLean with murder, went through several distinct emotional stages in rapid succession. Disbelief, rage, confusion, and finally a sort of cunning calculation as he realised he could turn this to his advantage. "So you've brought me the real killer, have you, Macbeth?" Blair's whiskey-laden breath preceded him down the corridor. "And how exactly did you manage that when my entire team was working around the clock on this case?" "Just lucky, sir," Hamish said blandly. "I happened to be at the Heritage Centre when Mrs. Menzies began talking about the case. She made some comments that didn't quite add up, and one thing led to another." Blair's piggy eyes narrowed suspiciously. He knew Hamish too well to believe in simple luck. "What sort of comments?" "Details about the crime scene that only the killer would know. I recorded our conversation." Hamish produced his mobile phone. "It's all here, sir, a full confession." Jimmy Anderson appeared at Blair's elbow, his expression carefully neutral. "That's excellent work, sir. The press will be pleased that we've solved such a complex case so quickly." That was the magic word. Press. Blair's face transformed, his suspicion melting into something approaching glee. "Aye. Well. Good work, Macbeth. Though I'll need to review the evidence myself, of course. Can't have any procedural irregularities." "Of course not, sir." Blair waved a fat hand. "Anderson processed the suspect. I'll handle the media briefing." He strutted off, already composing headlines in his mind where he would be the hero of the hour. After Blair had gone, Jimmy turned to Hamish with a wry smile. "You do realise he's going to take credit for the entire investigation?" "I'm counting on it," Hamish said. "The last thing I need is commendations and promotions. I'm very happy exactly where I am." "You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth." "Aye, but I'm a content one." The processing of Morag took several hours. She maintained her composure throughout, answering questions with calm precision, showing no remorse and no fear. When they led her to the cells, she paused only once, turning back to Hamish. "I don't expect you to understand," she said quietly, "but I'm not sorry. Some debts can only be paid in blood." Hamish said nothing. What could he say? That he understood the desire for revenge but couldn't condone murder? That he sympathised with her loss but had still arrested her? The law was the law, even when it felt inadequate to address the complexities of human suffering. He drove back to Loch Dubh as night fell, the familiar landscape gradually replacing Strathbane's grimness. The village looked peaceful in the darkness, lights glowing in cottage windows, smoke rising from chimneys into the cold air. The first person to intercept him was Mrs. Wellington, who had apparently been watching for his return. "Hamish? Is it true? Was it really Morag all along?" "I'm afraid so." "But she was so helpful, so kind." Mrs. Wellington struggled with the cognitive dissonance. She brought scones to the detectives. She made lists. She was always offering assistance. "Sometimes the most helpful people are the ones with the most to hide," Hamish said gently. News of Morag's arrest spread through Loch Dubh like wildfire through heather. By the next morning, the entire village was dissecting every interaction they'd ever had with the quiet archivist, searching for signs they'd missed, clues they'd overlooked. The Curry sisters were particularly vocal in their analysis. "I always thought there was something odd about her," Nessie declared, which was a blatant rewriting of history. Something odd, Jessie agreed. Too helpful, if you ask me. Too helpful, Hamish let them talk. The village needed to process the shock of discovering that a murderer had been living among them, hiding behind a facade of gentleness and civic duty. Then Archie McLean was released that same morning, emerging from Strathbane police station looking rumpled and bewildered. His wife collected him with a sharp lecture about staying out of trouble, which everyone knew meant he'd be back in the pub cellar within a week. Dr. Brodie stopped by the police station that afternoon, ostensibly to check on Hamish's health, but actually to express his relief that the case was solved. I was starting to worry that someone might have seen me with that salmon, he confessed. Thank God it was nothing to do with the murder. Your secret's safe with me, Hamish assured him. Just remember what I said about legal fishing. Absolutely. Scout's honour. The doctor paused. Poor Morag, though. To carry that grief for 40 years and then snap like that. It's tragic, really. It is. After the doctor left, Hamish sat by his fire with lugs at his feet and Sonsi purring on his lap. The case was solved, the killer was in custody, and Lochdoub would gradually return to normal, but he couldn't quite shake the melancholy that had settled over him. Morag had been destroyed by the sins of the past, had let her grief ferment into something dark and murderous, and while justice had been served, it felt hollow somehow. Alistair Vane had been a thoroughly unpleasant individual who had made his living by exploiting others. His death had removed a predator from the world. But that didn't make it right, didn't make murder acceptable. The law was the law, and Hamish had upheld it. But Highland justice had always been more complex than simple legality. 2 days later, Jimmy Anderson called with news. Blair's held a press conference. You should have seen him, Hamish. Talked about his brilliant investigative work, his keen psychological insights, his ability to see through the killer's deceptions. Jimmy laughed. Never mentioned your name once. Perfect. The superintendent is so pleased with Blair's handling of the case that he's recommending him for a commendation. Jimmy's voice was rich with irony. Meanwhile, you're being officially noted as having provided adequate local support, but showing no particular initiative or detective ability. Even better. You really are content with this, aren't you? More than content. It means I won't be transferred to Strathbane or promoted to sergeant or given any additional responsibilities that would take me away from Lochdoub. Hamish scratched lugs behind the ears. I've got my village, my peace, and my simple life. That's all I've ever wanted. After he rang off, Hamish made himself a cup of tea and looked out at the loch. The winter sun was setting, turning the water to molten gold. In the distance he could see smoke rising from the village hall's chimney, as the community prepared for their Hogmanay celebration, which would go ahead as planned now that the murder was solved. There would be the traditional bonfire, the first footing, the whisky and the singing. Life would continue in Lochdoub as it always had, marked by the rhythms of the seasons and the unchanging traditions of the Highlands. The case of Morag Menzies would become part of village lore, told and retold until the facts blurred into legend. People would remember the quiet archivist who had fooled them all, then who had hidden murder behind kindness and revenge behind helpfulness. But they would also remember that justice had been done, that Hamish Macbeth had quietly solved the case while letting others take the credit. It was, the villagers agreed among themselves, very typical of their lazy constable. Hamish smiled at that thought. Lazy. If only they knew how hard he worked to maintain that reputation, how carefully he navigated the treacherous waters between solving crimes and avoiding promotion. He finished his tea and went to feed his sheep, lugs trotting beside him and Sonsi prowling through the twilight in search of mice. The evening air was crisp and clean, and somewhere in the village someone was playing the pipes, the melancholy notes drifting across the darkening landscape. Tomorrow there would be other problems, other small dramas that required his attention. Mrs. Wellington would complain about someone's cat. The Curry sisters would report suspicious strangers who turned out to be perfectly innocent tourists. Archie would need rescuing from his wife's temper. It was the pattern of life in Lochdoub, and Hamish Macbeth wouldn't have traded it for anything. He returned to his croft house as night fell completely, the stars emerging one by one in the Highland sky. Inside, the peat fire crackled welcomingly, and he had a piece of shortbread waiting for his supper. Lug settled on the rug with a contented sigh. Sonsie claimed the warmest chair, her purr a low rumble of satisfaction. And Hamish sat between them, a lazy constable in a peaceful village, exactly where he belonged. Outside, the black waters of the loch reflected the starlight, and the village of Lochdubh slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that justice had been served and their constable was watching over them, even if he did seem remarkably lazy about it.